Okay, I think we'll get going. Thank you all for coming. My name is Dr. Robin Schuldenfrei, and I teach modern architecture and design history here at the Courthold. And I also run the speaker series through the Research Forum, just called Vietnamese, in which we invite a whole range of speakers, usually about one a term. But every year, I like to do a joint project with the Courthold Architecture Society. This is a completely student-run group who organize really interesting site visits and cultural events. Sometimes they do see films together, they do walks and things like that. So this is an event that is almost entirely student-run. And so I wanted to hand over the mic to our representatives from the Courthold Student Society.
Hello everyone, thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Flora Perry, I'm the president of the Courthold Architecture Society. If you're not a member yet, be sure to follow us on Instagram for any future events. The Architecture Society is honoured to invite architect Doug Loh here today with the support of Dr. Robin Schuldenfrei and the Courthold Research Forum. We've invited Doug to speak on Vietnamese modernist architecture, a fascinating yet mostly overlooked subject. He has spent years documenting the transformation of Vietnamese modernist architecture, uncovering the personal stories and forgotten structures that define it. His research highlights how these buildings were shaped by both creative adaptation and political necessity, resulting in an architectural heritage that is both rich and at risk. The aim of this talk is to delve into the complexities that have shaped Vietnamese architecture throughout the 20th century. By juxtaposing unofficial personal accounts, unloved archival records, alternative histories, myths, and local anecdotes, more comprehensive interpretations emerge that allow us to empathise with numerous entangled agents, whose fates were often tragic and forgotten. The discussion will also examine the present condition of Vietnam's neglected modernist heritage sites and touch on experimental preservation methods within his architectural practice, which aim to preserve their legacy while rediscovering Vietnamese architectural identity.
Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Doug Loh is an architect and director at CONX. Graduated from the Manchester School of Architecture and the Architectural Association, Doug has worked extensively on architectural projects in the UK, Eastern Europe, and Vietnam, with a focus on heritage, adaptive reuse, and creative preservation. Doug has served as an associate lecturer and design unit master at the University of Greenwich and Master of Brooks University, and as a course tutor at the Architectural Association Visiting School. He is also a regular visiting critic at many architectural schools in the UK and Vietnam. Doug engaged with architecture in both practice and theory, having previously contributed to the Plaquette Research Platform and advised the Hanoi Ad Hoc Initiative. He initiated the Grids of Vietnamese Modernism, a project focusing on the historiography and critique of Vietnamese architecture in the 20th century. Doug is currently a PhD candidate under the Practice Research Symposium program at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology University, a founding member of Zanzibar Collective, and a co-director at the Architectural Association Visiting School. Doug is also an extremely generous peer and mentor, always open to sharing his resources to researchers that, like myself, may have less experiences navigating through this layered, often fractured, and gay-kept field. We hope today's talk will therefore serve as another step in this multi-layered process of making the complexities of 20th century Vietnamese architecture more accessible to all. So without further ado, I will now hand it over to Doug. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Schuldenfrei, the Research Forum, and for all of you for the invitations. It's actually I'm really honored to present the topic that I find really close to my heart, that is institutions. I think the presentations is a synthesis of some of my research, my work, my design work, the archive work, which I hope will contribute to a broader conversations in preservation. I think in the past decades, I would say that Vietnamese modernist architecture started to get a lot more attention. Inter-publications and both with economic growth and with the change happening in the country, it often get overlooked because of its similarity to Chinese architectures. But in its way that in itself in 20th century, it contained the uniqueness that given the political context. Oh, sorry. the political landscape and history context that they're quite unique. So I would say that there's a certain kind of efforts and resilience of the previous generations of architects who try to experiment within their own means to eventually create an identity of Vietnamese architectures. I would like to start by sharing something personal, image, China. I think I was born in the late 1980s, and during peacetime with a lot of significant change. And being away from home for like 20 years, every trip going back is like going to the family photo archive. And again, being an architect, you start to notice, just this tiny building, very fun, getting closer and getting closer. Normally widely painted, modulars, straight line, and often out of context. You would never look at them and say it's Vietnamese architectures. And within this, there's choices. It's almost like they have a certain quality. You look at the photograph, look at the textures, almost like a dreamlike in a way. Now, interestingly, this is the building in Đà Lạt. Đà Lạt is a city about the center of Vietnam, and the name is Modern Hotel. And I think roughly about 10 years later, probably changing in terms of the color of the owner hotel is now renamed Modern, which is another kind of tilted way to say modern. But Modern literally translation is beautiful dream. So in a way that I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but maybe modernism in Vietnam is kind of like a beautiful dream. Now, of course, the history of Vietnam throughout 20th century is not something that's just beautiful. It's filled with major events, filled with colonizations, wars, and divisions and reunifications. And as a mantra saying in terms of architecture of the world, the epoch, then you start to see it across Vietnam. The change sometimes can take place quite slowly. Like at the top of it, you can see this is 4 photographs of the same site. It kind of changing from classical building to Art Deco to a bit Soviet, and in 2007 it get destroyed and rebuilt this kind of prestige, French architecture. Or it can take place in a much more violent way. And this is the photo of Chung statue in Saigon getting teared out, kicked, burned, mutilated, I think in 1963 during the demolition coup. And the sculptor who designed that, 7 years later, he designed that facade of moving to residential palace. I think we architects tend to look at different aspects of architecture. We research, we look at the plan, we look at the typology, we look at the section, but if we take away the context, sometimes it's getting really confused. You look at the 6 out of 6 photos, 3 of these are Vietnamese. We can't not sure without looking at the context, without looking at the hidden detail and influences. Then it's almost like pointless to just purely look at the tectonic of the buildings. Now, do we look at this building and we kind of remind us of Le Corbusier, Villa Savoye in some way, in a way that there's pilotis, it's setting back. But this building was built, it's Notre Dame de Rocher, built in Hanoi in roughly about in 1910s, about 20 years before Villa Savoye was built in Poissy. And in political and historic context, kind of shape building, and the building become the focal point that facilitate change in the general public. And in the country of Vietnam, where with a lot of up and down, it becomes quite interesting to really look at the reason, the driver, the influences that change building, and the action and reaction, how people receive it in a way. So this is the theater just now that I showed, and it almost like people sucking in, spitting out the kind of new group of people through films and theaters and things. It's really hard to pin down 100 years of Vietnamese architecture history, but this is my attempt at it. So I consider in a way that there's in wave of influences, and then there's wave of influence and wave of internalization. So I would say that there's first 2 waves of external influences, and followed by the 2 waves of internalization, whereby Vietnamese architects start to change, start to adapt, start to use what they learn to start design and build. So I go through it along the way, and So obviously the first way in about 1858 is when France first occupied Vietnam, and similar to many cases of colonizations, they use assimilation policy, aiming to integrate local subject into French culture, governance, identity. These three buildings are all multidisciplinary theater, in the three big cities in Vietnam: Hanoi, Haiphong, and Saigon. And then many people consider both of Vietnamese modern architecture with the formations of the École de Beaux-Arts Ligne and the person who can instigate that is Victor Tadeu. This is him in front of his work, The Metropole, in 1926. Of course, Tadeu is, when he won the Prix de Ligne, he came to Hanoi and he was extremely inspired by the local landscape, cultures, and traditions. And he really encouraged this kind of merging and blending between the European academics about with the Vietnamese aesthetics. The scene, the metropole scene, is depicting the moment of vaccinations. So people in Vietnam go into the station to vaccinate, to expose to technologies and different things. The school is formed in 24, and then eventually the architecture school is formed in 26. And as you see, there is the technique and the training is very Western. They use tones, drawing. On the wall you can see projection. Projections means that very abstract, and you don't really see in Asian art early. Now this is one of the exercise templates that to show the architecture drawing. The subject matter is very Vietnamese. It's very contextualized. This is really famous, the single pillar temple in Vietnam. So this is one of the exercises to do. It's important to understand that this moment, that 1920, is roughly the time when the French policy changed from assimilation into association, which is the moment when they try to combine, try to convince the local. So Ernest Hillbrook was one of the great components of this area. This is one of his design in the International War Center in 1912, but when he goes to Vietnam, he started to design much bigger real civic building that the combination of French architecture with local elements and embellishment and decorations. But it's important to be aware that there's a lot of misconception that in Vietnam that this is Vietnamese architecture. This is not. This is French architecture with pattern, colonized kind of pattern. And one of the things is all the pattern is actually taken from a wide range, from Madagascar, from Cambodia, from Laos, and just kind of shot together, and then that becomes in a way that it's probably good to put it down and say this is not Vietnamese architectures. At the same time, within the school, we have the new generations of teachers. So one article was introduced to the school. This kind of idea of the language of proto-modern architecture in Vietnam. Arthur Cruz was one of the head who was in charge of Vietnamese architecture departments, and he founded a firm with Beauvais and Alexander Leonard, and they do multiple this building, ranging from I think this is a private building to residentials to the Royal Palace, and this is another building, the Bank of Indochina. Now, the ideas of geometric form with clean line and decorative motifs, and this is illustrative into progress in Vietnam at that time. Now, the graduate of École de Beaux-Arts, initially they all wanted geared toward working in local governments, but once they get exposed to all this new language, when they finished school, they went out and set up their own firm. And but instead of doing much bigger projects, because they tend to do a lot more smaller villas, so Kaolian or like Visual or they are all working on just small private villas, but in the same kind of language in a way. And then there was a debate during this time now, whereby the Vietnamese architecture graduate, they purposely reject the single Indo-Chinese style because they do consider that the Art Deco was much more progressive and it more of a way to resist colonization and their way of nation building during that time. Now the second way of influence is strongly determined by the division of Vietnam and its political and historical context. And in 1945 is when the World War II ended, Vietnam declared independence. But France quickly occupied the South, and in '54 it's a proper split, and then there's communist North Vietnam and American like South Vietnam, and that's when there's a completely split. It's also good to take note that that the school is a bit small. I apologize. The echoes are here and there because of the change. Probably half of the graduate went to the north for revolutionary. They went to the north side, and the rest of it, the school moved to Dalat and eventually to Ho Chi Minh. And this moment started from two strands of school in Vietnam, the north and south. So clear in the way they draw, clear difference in the way they think, and clear difference in the way they approach architectures. So as for the south of Vietnam, everything is very much market-based, very institutional constructions. In the South, with the Americans and the French influence are quite dominant, a lot of major investment, outlook, and then you start to have colonial modernist style that combine to create a new kind of, to promote individualism and adaptability. I think private lands policy and market-driven development led to a lot of diverse and experimental projects. So this is what you see is a magazine back in the day. It says it most literally new constructions, and then you start to promote new kind of housing, new kind of local shop house, and introduce new way of life in a way that was quite prevalent during that day at that time. Now, new architecture office and collaboration was formed to facilitate this new design lexicon. And of course, with the new demands, the architect shown in this photo is Nguyen Hoa. He's his office is probably one of the most prominent office in the South in the day. He studied under Arthur Cruz that I mentioned, but his design is much more clean, a lot more simple, a lot more progressive, and this is one of his hotels that he designed. And if we look purely into the drawing, his drawing was impeccable. The craftsmanship of his drawing in Vietnam was massively different. So maybe that's why he's so successful in his communication, his way of portraying the vision of what it is. And of course, apart from that, besides the architect who studied in Vietnam, there is I think a dozen of Vietnamese who transferred the study and finished the study in France, in Paris, École de Paris. And probably the famous of all of them is Ngo Viet Thu, which is the only Asian who won the Prix de Rome. He eventually returned to design the presidential palace in Saigon. Another case of another Vietnamese architect who came back and he was extremely successful was Do Công Văn, whereby he designed the Pontifical College of Saint Pius X. And if you look at that photo, and then it's roughly about 10 years difference, but the way the building is designed, the context is very similar to Le Corbusier and La Tourette in a way. Now, unfortunately, if you visit Vietnam right now, this is completely gone. The building, with over-urbanization, the building has been consumed by a jungle of concrete, so it's no longer there. It's just a vision. It's a nice photo. What a shape! Grave pins, it's magnificent. As far as the north, it's very typical. Under the leadership of communist regimes, you have this heavy influence by China and Vietnam, Soviet unions and the broader communist bloc, and this reinforced nation building. Obviously, monuments, monumental social architecture, even though Vietnamese tend to have smaller scale because of less grant, and the design focusing on state project, social housing, and pragmatic over function over aesthetic. So this is just two of the master planning that people draw. I think most of this pretty much focusing on social housing and some of the main building, large boulevard, but very few of this master plan actually completed. Now the project like the Youth Palace, the Youth Palace was designed by a gentleman named Levan Lenin, is a clear example of a state project with foreign aid in this case Czechoslovakia. Now occupy the prime location of the city and showing the long-term vision of the government. I think Len would train in Vietnam, and then after that go to East Germany, go to Russia to train and to hone his design. And I think generations of children went to this. I went to this to learn to draw, to chess. I can Carmen went to this to learn how to dance as well. And if you even look closely, that's a ladder from Russia. Whereby it's clearly, the assistant is not just from its technological assistant, is it's a lot of if other thing is finances, funds, and maintenance, all aspect of systems. Obviously, there's social housing block, and we use in the social north we use a model called Hutate, which is collective zone, or it's based on micro rayon system in Russia, a micro district whereby there's residential block, shop, kindergarten, and other facility. Sometimes they build on their own. This is research by Vietnam, North Thanh Xuân and Văn Chương is research by Vietnam, or sometimes it's assisted by Germany, by East Germany. This is from Vinh, which is the city that's most born city in when we built it. And overall, there's a lot of mantra, but this is one of them, applicable, sustainable, aesthetic within the possible means, which is you can do it as uniform as possible, but if you have a chance, you do something slightly different. So this is one of the cases whereby at the end of the building, you start to have a beautifully identifiable mosaic pattern at the end of the building, or sometimes there's a pattern that you have on the buildings. And of course, like, the whole point of all of this Russian and Soviet model is so that you can convert people in Vietnam into a new, the new desired population, the new Soviet socialist men and women. But a lot of times you see adult doesn't really get really well with it, and people just use things differently. Probably there's no confirmation, but I think these people washing clothes in the public fountains. Children tend to be using, this kind of social engineering a lot better in a way. They use it the right way. And the first way of internalization is when architects start to facing all that. They start to adapt. So in this case, the two photos on the screen, one of them is a temple, one of them is a church. Form and content tend to be a bit separate in a way. There's a kind of idea of juxtaposition, very crude juxtapositions of idea of modern construction with some elements of traditional elements. Eclecticism is widely accepted. Add-on is welcome in a way. The experimentation is constantly kind of changing, and with warm climate and what we know nowadays as tropical modernism, where you see the idea of double walls, of setting backs, of overhangs that facilitate shading and cross ventilations. I think the play of massing and shadow is actually quite interesting. Where you can see that kind of shadow that start to form and draw pattern. It's almost like drawing painting the shadow on the facade of the canvas, which is a facade. This is a building by moving, another building by moving to in way. This is the University of Education. And of course, certain poetic aspect of Vietnamese culture start to seep into the design language. Vietnamese call this kind of pattern windflower, whereby it's cross ventilation, but in a way that it's quite poetic. I don't know why they name it like windflower, but it's repeated across Vietnam, different building, and each of this, I think maybe this is a way when we mention about aesthetic when possible. This is one of the way that they kind of carry out that aesthetic whenever possible. So this is, and so that's the south. The north again have a very different ideas of internalizations, and which while the south have put the roof on top, the north take it off. So in 1960, when the Vietnamese, when the North Vietnamese trying to set up a new architecture school, they went to China, obviously, and then also I think that China started to come and help to design the National Assembly, and I think by a scholar, this is considered a national style in China. And 2 years later, immediately the Vietnamese, when they design, this is a two graduate from Dubai, they just take off the roof, they don't do it again. The budding ceremony stand, which is very near to this building, I think in 55, designed with the interesting Chinese roof, Asian roof, let's not call it Chinese roof, Asian roof. 5 years later, he just take it off, completely neoclassical. So in a way that what I would say that there's, now given the political situation, everyone can treat quite lightly. They don't want to, everything become more subtle and subversive. A lot of, things done without formal confirmation and agreement. And I would say that In this case, like me, I don't know, I don't know if they like ornament is a crown. So in this case, maybe the free of ornaments is independence or something. So in a way that's. And obviously, this subtle kind of internalization happened from a lot of places. This is one of the right opposite of that example, and that obviously is Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum. So when Ho Chi Minh passed away in '69, he did not want to be entombed at all. But as a founding father of the nation, everyone want to give him the proper test. So the plan was to allow an architect called Isakovich and Menezes, who designed any musical mausoleum, to design this, but eventually it became competitions. I think 200 different kind of design setting, and it's quite massive. Different idea, different institution will have their different take on this. But I want to talk about two particular entry by this particular architect, Nguyễn Công Hoa, who designed one of the first in KTT, the collective housing, and then he designed this temple. And if you're in Vietnam, you know that within any kind of KTT there's this small ramp. That was his design. With the whole purpose of that is when you carry in Vietnam there used to be just a lot of bicycles, so you need something to just grab up to take. And this is, if you remove wind flower, this is what it looked like inside from wind flowers. He designed these two quite wonderful entry, and the idea what he wrote in his personal notebook, whereby he wanted to focus on the kind of spiritualities and the Vietnamese aspect of it, how does this can reflect Ho Chi Minh characters. He used a lot of abstractions, so this design is about, if you take the flag of Vietnam and you put on a coffin, so it's kind of folded like that, and then that formed the shape, and he just translated into the design. When people look at this and people say that, oh, this looks like a modern temple, it is practically a coincidence, but in a way that he said, well, if it does the job, then it does the job. This is another option that become more conservative. Now, eventually, this was the design solutions, very straightforward. Obviously, credit to the Russians. But in the act of defiance, when the Vietnamese constructed it, they were tilt on that. In a way that it tilt, and there's an abstraction of the Vietnamese roof in a way. And I would say that this that's why I call this guerrillas ideology that is embedded in the kind of larger scheme of things as an act of resistance, as the abstraction become a tool of independence in a way. So the certain dynamic is quite interesting. And then the second way of internalization is when everything starts to mature. So this is a library design in Ho Chi Minh, whereby you start to see everything that coming together, the overhang, the abstraction of the roof, the wind flower were with symbologies, and even every single detail is quite abstracted in a way. The North have a slightly different approach, but it's also very much in abstraction. This is a museum by Tam Duc in 80s. There's a play of plane, there's a play of massing. The building is still, you can still see the kind of abstractions of the Vietnamese timber joinery. And then there's a play between the kind of square, plan, and circle, which is Vietnamese symbol for sky and earth, in a way, that's the level of mysticism. Or in the case of with Vo Hung, he designed the International Hospital. And the way that Vo Hung is really a bit about trying to combine, trying to westernize, and not westernize, trying to combine Western idea, Western design language and traditional language, whereby he take the traditional module combination, he put out sections, and he start to create his own order. Instead of classical, he created his own Vietnamese order. He called it Vo Hung order, and he applied it into his building, and it become something quite strong and quite distinctive. Sadly, this building again has been destroyed. And of course, in terms of mysticism and idea, and eventually, there's architects who start to design this kind of strange. There's a myth in Vietnam whereby the Vietnamese come from 100 kings, so that's why he designed a house at 100 rooms house. And then also in this later, he designed this monument, ceremonial monument, whereby tradition is cut onto the kind of monolithic modern design. So that's a kind of combination of mysticism and modern design. Now, I think about all that kind of wave of influence, I did not put a date on, but if we start to putting a date on it, this is how it kind of look. And in a way that you can start seeing patterns whereby architects from the north, their practice tend to be quite fluctuate. They move across different kind of style. Like this is one of the activities, just move across water and jump up and down. So the southern architect tend to be a bit more stable. He went from, they probably have a lot more room and liberty to practice, to design. And then, so for example, this is one of them. So this is one of the graduates from the EBI from École de Beaux-Arts, and then he was designed with Art Deco. He go into a bit proto-modern, and eventually become this weird expressions of trying to design this is an archaeological museum in the north, a bit like a line mains is what he's trying to express, maybe. And in a way that, when I take this and as an architect, when I look at all this, and architects like to cut a slide section everywhere, and then when you cut a section through, you start to form this kind of concentric rings. The outer ring is the two kind of external influences. The core of it is the traditional value of Vietnam, and all the building and ideas tend to draw and fluctuate between these concentric rings. And but again, this is it's very small. You can't really show everything, and it's hard to show all the relationship between individual and institutions and ideas. So we can't do something like this, whereby it becomes a much bigger map, and when you click on a point and you start to pull, and things start to move and shift and start to move around. If I zoom out, it starts to form almost like horoscope, maybe. And as a kind of curatorial, like moving data, it forms its own shape, and as this is constantly updated, and I hope that maybe different kind of form and cluster can be formed. It's easier. Some periphery, if you're not connected to anything, they just shoot into the periphery, and it's probably my job to try to reconnect them. And we talk about a lot of the grids. The modernist grid is 90 degree is flexible, but in this case, the grid is, it's not rigid. It's contract. It expands. It pulls other indices and it pushes them away, so it's constantly changing. If we zoom in and we kind of freeze it, for example, and we start to see a pattern. So this line there, that is the trajectory of the École de Beaux-Arts, and this is from its beginning into its Ho Chi Minh University of Architecture. You can see the time get a bit. This is when you let it sit for a while and it stops moving. Time is a bit frozen and divided wrongly. So this is between two of this one. That's about 11 years. Between two of this, 2 years. And as it trajectory go through, you see go through a different cloud of intuitions, institution and agency, and it gives a new point of view so that you can interpret things, idea generations, and it really depends. And I really truly believe that when I create this, I try not to interpret it. I just leave it to people to interpret it. And in a way that the pathway almost like meandering through a system, and it kind of reminding me of of all the Vietnamese river. So this is one of the painting in Vietnamese river, but the Chinese painting in bloody portrait. So in a way that we've given all the kind of complexity and idea. Vietnamese architecture, just like architecture, just like the way they draw, they kind of meandering through, kind of switching. So I think, given all this complexity and quite beautifully thing, Vietnamese architecture is getting destroyed. Every year. This is last year. This is literally about a month ago. These beautiful buildings, and all this kind of destruction happened really strategically. They wait until the right moment where everyone goes and celebrate, and they go destroy. And last November, there's a creative design festival happened in front of this building, and everyone's coming and say, "Oh, it's a wonderful building." 2 months later, it just got destroyed. So, I have several theses on why Vietnamese architecture get destroyed a lot. From the point of view of culture and social point of view, right? Tabula rasa is something that's very prevalent in Vietnamese architectures. If you traditional architecture, if you build an ancestor house, all the material need to be new. You're not allowed to use old materials. So destructions and renew and completely inversion of what is something that is very common. So this is one of the village in where this is called the tomb city. This entire thing is just about ancestor house. There's not many people living here, and everyone can move to overseas and send money back to just build a tomb, and there's no one occupying it. So that's one way to explain it. The other way of explaining it is the kind of mantra that set by Ho Chi Minh after the war, whereby what he said was rebuilding our nation grander, bigger, and more beautiful. And the acceptance of rebuilding also facilitates that you can destroy whatever it is, you can rebuild it later. You don't need to preserve anything. So in a way that I think this is my interpretation. So it might be shaky, but that's I feel that it kind of ingrained in the consciousness of the Vietnamese construction industry. So, and because of it, all the destruction. So in my practice, I have a few ways. I'll probably go a bit faster in this sense. There's a few ways. There's 3 projects that we talk about preservation. So obviously, this is the building that I showed previously, and there's no drawing about this at all. We couldn't find a record. So we use a technique of geometric restitution, whereby based on drawing, we redraw the facade, we can shuffle, and then we can reconstruct the facade with the design, and then compile all the kind of oral interview, kind of rebuilding it. So there's a kind of records of what it was. We're getting closer to the information that we didn't have. All this particular building here, we can't, now Vietnamese modernism, we also look at a lot of drawings. So this is one of the buildings that we find like hundreds of drawings, and then it's all sit there and kind of just dingy and red, chewed up, and it's terrible. And if you've been to Vietnam, there's, if you go to any kind of government building in Vietnam, there's always U-shape. It's always very old school U-shape. And this building is one of the kind of buildings that beginning that kind of typologies. And the reason why is that in 1979 there was a war between China and Vietnam, and China has a possibility to attack Hanoi at any time. So the mantra, the principle right then is any government building needs to be a building and a fortress. It needs to be able to protect, to fight. So this is the ground floor, and all of these are police warriors, whereby you can poke out this. There's a step here as you go in. This form a pincer, whereby you can shoot out and can defend the building. So this is one of the first government buildings that was designed such a way. And in Vietnam has the kind of prolifications of buildings, and they will design a kind of template. They send out to different kind of city, and then they say, you should design this way. So this is the front building. Then there's many elements that is both modern and both very much local culture. So this is the 5 gates. So the 5 gates represent the 5 gates of to enter Hanoi, which is the kind of traditional gates going to Hanoi. Unfortunately, now this side of the building has been. This side was never built. This side now has been converted to a prestige French architectures. The center block is still kind of preserved there. And as we kind of going through all the building, we start to be a bit creative and think we can start. So we extract, we kind of think about this kind of dust drawing, extracting it, and when we study the pixel and the grain, we start to find mold, we start to find where people start to put their pen and highlight which part of the building is important, message and thing. And sometimes there's a calculation of how much money does it take of the cigarette that the architect smoked. So there's a lot of hidden kind of story underneath the drawing. And this drawing there's only one of them. They take this onto the side. They built with this, and every single note was written on it. So this is quite an interesting drawing. So that's, and obviously as an architect, I do building. So there's this building that get destroyed, rebuilt, and this is what it is now. We can see that it's so used that people start to put pickable, feel on it. So in a way that this is the kind of project that we try to. It's a competition that we're trying to preserve all the front, try to extend the back, giving it a bit new life. Let's say the entry that we're going to send. We try to do that kind of view, and probably not to send it viewing because you never look at angle from the back. So that's something we have to be careful about. And the project is also a Trojan horse for another project. That is, so the building is roughly here, and this 4 building designed by Chow Christian in 1930s. they are going to be destroyed and become car parks, whereby by doing that, we can structure a larger scale, and we say, maybe you can preserve one of them, and the rest of it we can make it into a more, almost like picunists in Athens, where there's a floor and there's traces of building preservations. So I think as a group, as a practice, we will continue to collect drawings. Myself and a group of photographer and cartographer, we preparing a map, something like this, and we're going to have a system of grading of heritage grading, whereby because the government actually, modernist building, the government don't actually put a grade on it. They don't really recognize it as heritage. So we will do it ourselves. Right? We do a bit of teachings. So this is a bit of shameless promotion. We have a course that coming out about preservations and recording and 3D scanning. So that all this effort is taken in so that the city, all this modernist legacy are preserved. The city is full of meaning, so that it's not just a beautiful dream. So I think that's it.